So now we can begin the sessions. I would request the moderator to go ahead. Thank you.
Can you hear me just now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and absolutely sorry for but I'm absolutely sorry for all that happened. I've got the microphone has been on, and suddenly the technological problem came in, and I'm absolutely sorry for that. So I'll just quickly recap what I've said. I'm absolutely sorry about it. I'm Leta Gorecka. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Strathclyde in Great Britain, and I'm today's moderator at the conference. So our panel is entitled Algorithmic Trading and Monetization, Policy Constraints for Disruptive Technologies, and I kindly welcome all of you guys, especially the panelists, and because we're going to have a very rewarding discussion today. So before we start, so today's schedule of the conversation is follow that we've got 4 panelists which will discuss a couple of the questions, and we welcome some questions from the audience, but I'll be very thankful if the audience could put their questions in the chat box rather than switching on their microphone in the middle of the conversation, because this might interrupt our panelists. So if everything seems to be clear, we're able to start, and I welcome the panelists. Can I ask the first panelist to introduce himself or herself and say a couple of words about their work and their engagement with algorithmics?
Right. Hi. I'm given to understand that I will go first, so I'll take a dig at this. My name is Ratu Roshan. I work with Ikigai Law, which is a tech and innovation focused law firm based out of New Delhi. Our engagement with AI is primarily on the policy and regulatory level, not so much on the regulatory given how AI is evolving in India currently, but definitely a lot on the policy level, which means that we help companies navigate and understand how the AI ecosystem in the country will develop. We also assist governments in the limited capacity that we can by sending in comments and our positions and our opinions on how we feel the AI ecosystem will best develop in the country, and what would lead to the most conducive ecosystem for the development of AI in the country. So that's me. That's me. Thank you so much. It's definitely a privilege to be here amongst all of these experts.
Great. Thank you very much. Can I ask speaker number 2 to introduce? We're absolutely sorry. We can't hear you.
Hello? I'll go second. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes, thank you.
Great. All right. So my name is Pooja Terwad. I'm a startup attorney. I run a law firm, which we have our offices headquartered in Mumbai and the other one in Singapore. We are a startup-focused law firm. We provide end-to-end services to startups. We've been here for the last 5.5 years, and we work with over 500 plus startups and 100 plus investors, and a lot of them working in the emerging technology space. We also advise Maharashtra government and Gujarat government with their startup policies, and how can the startup policies be more effective, specifically keeping in view tech-based tech startups, specifically working in the AI and emerging technology space. So yeah, so that's me. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Can I ask Mr. Rodriguez to introduce himself, please?
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Rodriguez. I specialize in the area of AI and machine learning, especially with focus in the field of quantum computing. I'm more of a technical side, not so much on the law side, but I do firmly believe in the regulation of AI, coming from this field on a technical background, especially because I'm from Spain, so I'm very much aware of the GDPR constraints that is not applicable in countries like India. So that will be an interesting part to see how that evolves here. I'm currently the Dean at the School of Business at Washington University in Hyderabad. And to keep it brief, that's pretty much it all.
Great, thank you very much. And Miss Namjoshi, welcome again. I know that you had some issues with the microphone, so welcome again. I can't hear you now. If you use a Safari, if you use MacBook and you use a Safari as your browser, you'll need to look at the top of the screen and you'll see a microphone on the tag by the meet.global.com. Often the microphone is just crossed, and it seems that even if you're allowed to use the voice, there might be an issue and you need to do it again. No, we can't. No, we still can't hear you. Roll just suggested that it might be an issue with a Google Meet, and usually it's resolved when you log in from your phone. No, you aren't. We'll wait like a minute or two for Ms. Namjoshi to join us, and then we'll be able to proceed with our discussion. Hello again.
Hi, let's give it a shot. Any chances I'm audible now?
You're audible now. Hello.
Yay. Yeah.
Algorithms and the related IP is put in the public domain so that all participants within the AI ecosystem are able to benefit from it. Which means that if today I were to make an algorithm which I've invested substantial time and energy into, and our letter feels that this is a great algorithm, why don't I just pick it up and use it, right? That's something that may be enabled. I mean, the discussion paper does not say that this will definitely be it, but from a very plain reading of what open sourcing of algorithms means that's what we're looking at. And of course, that's a red flag on pretty much all counts, because the organic incentive to innovate and create a competitive edge for yourself, as well as the question of user privacy, are all kinds of questions that come up when you want to open source your algorithms. Now, what's fairly funny, and I was having this discussion with a colleague very recently, is that multiple organizations, ministries have been trying to spearhead the conversation on AI, right? So the DOT is the latest entrant here. Usually the tussle has been between the Ministry of IT and Electronics and Information Technology, which is the METI, and the NITI Aayog, which is the central government think tank. And neither of these two entities in any of their earlier papers have made either of these two recommendations mandatory. They made it voluntary. They've said, you want to do it, you go ahead and do it. You don't want to do it, please don't do it. You want to do it in a limited manner, please go ahead and do it in a limited manner. Which begs the question, why is the DOT coming up with such a stringent and hard form of regulation, which no other ministry has or organization has spoken about earlier? There are certain lesser concerns as well. They speak of a central AI regulator, which is a horizontal regulator, which means that this particular regulator will be responsible for overseeing AI deployment across all sectors. Multiple problems here again. AI essentially is a sector-specific, it's a sector-driven initiative. The requirements, the motivations, the impediments for the deployment of AI solutions will vary across each sector, and therefore, for you to have one regulator which oversees AI deployment across all of these sectors is a one-size-fits-all solution, which we know does not work at all, right? And of course, AI in India is a fairly nascent sector. There aren't too many regulations. So for you to come up now with a regulator which will arguably exercise hard control and oversight will be a deterrent to innovation in some form or manner as well. And okay, another bit that came up fairly frequently amongst all of our conversations was there is also the recommendation to create a centrally controlled database of AI data, which is administered by a central controller. Now, that's about it as to what's said. I mean, that again, there isn't too much clarity. There's quite a lot of ambiguity there. But from again a plain reading, we understand that anyone who wants to participate in the AI stack will have to submit their data to the stack, which dovetails into the earlier conversation around competitiveness, IPR, misuse, user privacy, so on and so forth. But it also makes sure that you lose some amount of control as to how this data is used by other parties as well, because this data is the controller is a central government controller, and therefore once you've let go of the data from your tunnel and it's in their pipes, they determine how it will be used, and you have very little control over it. Of course, there are questions about how this will interact with the PDP, NPD, personal data protection and non-personal data protection for our international panelists. We have frameworks for regulating personal data, non-personal data coming up in India. And this begs the question, right? I mean, how will the DOT's vision of how AI should be regulated interact with what the earlier frameworks have spoken about? I will very quickly run through the last 2 points because I feel like I may have overshot my time. But yeah, I mean, the question of having an AI stack in itself begs the question, are you trying to set up prescriptive hard standards as to how AI should develop in any country? Now, from our conversations with industry bodies and many multinational firms, what we understand is that prescriptive regulation is something that almost any company will go against. They want to be able to provide services at their own, there is the organic incentive to make sure that you provide the best service, right? Otherwise, your users will not rely on you, they will not use your services. But when the government comes in and says you need to do this and nothing more and nothing less, it's a lose-lose situation for people who are not able to achieve that standard, as well as for people who are able to achieve more than that standard but are now not allowed to provide that standard, right? So monolithic prescriptive standards are something that the AI stack may envision going forward, and that's a problem. And of course, then there's the problem of long-term data storage. I had spoken about cold data. The discussion paper says that there may be some points of data which may not have to be accessed at all, and therefore we will store it in the form of cold data within using certain kinds of technologies. But when you think of this, or when you look at this from the lens of storage limitations within the PDP and similar stipulations on storage from sectoral regulators such as the Reserve Bank of India as well, it begs the question: how do you enforce those stipulations in those other instruments? How do you ensure data minimization? Why aren't you looking at data at federated learning, which actually does away with the requirement for a central database of data that will be used to train AI? I mean, when there are better alternatives in the market, why do we want to go back to more regressive alternatives such as collating all data and storing it for time on end when there are evidently better ways of going about it?
Two answers. So we've got like Saeed Anal asking you regarding open sourcing of algorithms, would issuing a non-assertion pledge enable the creator of algorithms to benefit from exploitation of algorithm while also ensuring that it's more easily accessible as compared to licensing of the algorithm? What are your thoughts on this?
Just give me a moment. I'm going to go through the question again. Regarding open sourcing of algorithms, would issuing non-assertion pledges enable the creator of algorithms to benefit from exploitation of the algorithm? Definitely. That's a fair question. But see, again, as we said, depending on the products that you're coming up with, right? You may want to make some of your products, you may want to voluntarily make them open source. You may voluntarily want to, gain some sort of commercial traction from it. You may want to fill your coffers from it. But there are also certain other kinds of solutions where you may not want to open source your algorithms. The problem is not with you tell private parties what they should be what they should do with their IPR. If I want to bring technology through the AI ecosystem, I'm well within my rights to do so, and I will be able to do so privately as well, right? Why does the government have to come in and tell me that this is something that I will definitely have to do if I need to participate within the AI stack? And the problem here is bigger than that. The problem is that while the AI stack itself, it's what we call voluntary mandatory, which means that in a sense, if you have any AI solution deployed in India, you will have to at some point participate in the AI stack. And that breeds a lot of problems, right? Because as I said, mandatory prescriptive standards are amongst the biggest deterrents that multinational companies face in any given country. On account of a myriad of reasons, and that's an entire conversation in itself. Happy to take that offline, but I hope that answers your question.
Right, thank you. And the next question is from Kabir Kumar asking, wouldn't such an approach cause regulatory burden? Would there be a legal mandate for EA players to take part in the IE stack? How would the government define AI, thereby clearly defining the regulatory ambit? Wouldn't this eventually stun innovation as the open source mandate removes any sort of incentives in creating a new innovative
Correct.
IP?
Kabir, I completely agree with you. As a matter of fact, that's something that I stressed upon. I probably just briefly touched upon it. That when it comes to regulatory, it definitely increases the regulatory burden, and a lot of parties have also come about and said that the Indian government probably does not have the technical wherewithal, let alone like financial is another bit, but the technical wherewithal to execute such a program, right? Because it's such a complex program, there are so many moving parts that it may not be very feasible for any government of the world at this point, especially to understand where to draw the line. So yes, they're definitely taking on a lot, they're biting off more than they can chew. But from what we understand right now is that it's a discussion paper, so we still have time. So we don't know that it will be when it will be and the manner, probably it's enforced in stages, it's implemented in stages. All that's a possibility. The second question was, wouldn't this eventually stun innovation as open source? Yeah, exactly. It definitely does, right? If I want to open source my algorithms, make money out of it, I'm free to do that, even when the government does not ask me to do it. But when you mandate me to do it, and this is quite a similar conversation that we were having within the realm of the Personal Data Protection Bill and the Non-Personal Data Protection Framework as well, there are stipulations there for mandatory data sharing as well. And they've come under a lot of fire as well, because not only does this take away your incentive to innovate and create a competitive edge for yourself, it also flies in the face of many of the IPR protections that the Indian law affords us, as well as some of our international obligations under the TRIPS, for instance, right? So what do you do about that? All of these are open questions, and all of these mandatory data sharing seems to be part of a larger umbrella conversation for the government, which is go local, promote domestic things. They want to make sure that smaller domestic startups are able to benefit from the IPR of larger companies that come into India, bring new technologies into India, and that becomes a problem. So this is a common string that has run across multiple regulatory documents that the government has released in the recent past. And your apprehension is absolutely correct. This is the first line of defense, that what happens to my organic incentive to innovate, right? Because you'll take it away from me in any case. So what happens to that?
Right, thank you very much. Since there are no further questions on point A, we're moving to point B, which is, in which Indian sector should we expect substantial movement on an artificial intelligence front going forward?
Right. So we undertook, thank you for your question. We undertook an internal research project of sorts, where we tried to assess how many sectors, or which ministries, organizations are thinking about deploying AI in any shape, way, or form within their sectors. And we were able to come up with 34 names within just a span of a few hours. So I don't think there is any ministry that's not looking to leverage AI going forward. Of course, the applications will be vastly different, but there is definitely one sector that the government is trying to promote, and that's agriculture. So agri-tech is a sector where the use of AI has been referenced time and again. And I think the reason for this is that in 2017, the government had come out with, if I'm not mistaken, a 14-volume report on how to double farmers' incomes by 2022. There were 14 volumes, of which in multiple volumes, they were generously peppered with references to emerging technologies, including AI, satellite imagery, robotics, IoT, big data, all sorts of big words thrown in there, right? And I think as a snowball effect of that, going forward, all other ministries as well as government think tanks have have zeroed in on agri-tech as the field where they want to see the first development on AI and the most development on AI, right? So if you talk about the Ministry of Commerce and Industry had set up an expert committee in 2018, and you would not expect the MOCI's committee to speak about agriculture, but it did. It did talk about how AI should be leveraged for crop selection, monitoring prediction, health management, mechanization, so on and so forth. The Niti Aayog came up with a similar AI strategy, which is the go-to document in India now when it comes to AI. This was 2018. They said we need to use AI for improved sowing, herbicide optimization, so on and so forth. It came up there again. The MATI had instituted I think it was instituted in 2018. The 4 reports came out in 2019, and even there was a heavy focus and a separate, distinct focus on how AI can be leveraged within the field of agriculture and agri-tech. Of course, the applications were, by and large, they were similar, but there was a larger expanse as well, right? I mean, they spoke of remote sensing, climatic predictions, disease detection, weed detection, animal recognition. And they spoke about creating a national mission where you would have data sets, algorithms, and solutions which will be able to optimize the use of AI in agriculture, or essentially just implement agri-tech, right? So the government has been doing this on pretty much a war footing. And as recent as August 2020, the government announced an agricultural infrastructure fund worth rupees 1 lakh crores. And there was a distinct section dedicated specifically to how part of this money will go to agri-entrepreneurs who will ensure that AI is leveraged in the sector of agriculture in a meaningful way. So I think this is one of the only sectors where the government has actually given independent, distinct thought as to how you can leverage AI in this sector. Everywhere else, it's very sector specific. Everywhere else, it's very ministry specific. But here, it's come from the central government. They know that where they want to focus their efforts, at least in the short run, is the use of AI in agriculture or agri-tech. And to this effect, they've even undertaken a lot of infrastructural projects, right? I mean, the examples that I gave you just now were all policy sort of, they were documents and they were recommendations. But the government has actually gone forward and invested substantially in certain infrastructural projects as well. The first of them, and probably the most important of them, being the ERAVAT. This is an acronym which is slightly, it's a bit of it's a misleading acronym because it spreads out into AI research and analytics and knowledge assimilation platform. But the idea is basically this: if we want to leverage AI in India, why not have a common cloud platform for it with both public and private participation? And that common platform will be called the ERAVAT. So the ERAVAT will make sure that you're storing all data sets for the training of AI within India. That you don't have to invest in the storage of those data sets. That you leverage this government platform that is given to you again to be able to build upon it, and therefore probably have some sort of economies of scale as well. But I think the more important and the more interesting, at least, infrastructural development, which is still in the pipeline, I'll just clarify that, is the agri stack. Again, as we spoke of the AI stack and the India stack, there is also substantial conversation around a separate agri stack. Now, we don't know the exact architecture of the agri stack because no government has come out with a definitive and an authoritative paper on it. But from what we've heard in industry circles, it will for now comprise of 3 layers, which will be the farmer stack, which is essentially how do you identify farmers? You make sure that, okay, this is the fellow who owns this much land in this much area, and therefore these are his requirements. The farm stack, which would be used to identify the dimensions and the requirements of different farming needs and their potential across the country. That would be the farm stack. And the crop stack, which would help you identify specific needs and impediments for specific crops within the country. So all of that's there. I mean, the agri stack is something that the policy space in AI especially has been awaiting with bated breath, but we don't see a document coming out any soon. There haven't been any murmurs around it as well. But this is definitely something that is going to come out, and it will be game changing. So we'll probably have another panel for that, right? Again, there are other infrastructural initiatives as well. One is the Krishi Megh, which translates roughly to Farmer Cloud. And this is a data recovery center established at the National Academy of Agricultural Research and Management in Hyderabad. It's essentially to make sure that the ICAR, which is the Indian Council for Agricultural Research, their data is is safeguarded in case of any calamity, and therefore they've built a mirroring sort of a infrastructure at the back end. And they're also trying to, when it comes to the iCar itself, the iCar has a data center based out of Delhi. They have integrated that with AI capabilities and deep learning capabilities as well going forward. So we definitely see a pointed focus on leveraging AI within agriculture more than any other field at this particular point of time. Happy to take questions.
I would humbly request
thank
the moderator to actually take the questions at the end. I think because it would be okay to go ahead. Please take the questions from the ask the panelists further questions, and take the questions from the audience in the end. I think that would be the best suggestion. Thank you.
Yes, certainly, I agree. Thank you very much for that. I was actually about to advise participants to keep the questions for the end since we're running quite short of time. So I invite Akasha to answer some of the questions we've got prepared for you. So the first question is, how are the algorithms impacting the fintech industries, and what are some of the governance issues of the same?
Right. Thank you for that question. So actually, our experience in this region actually has been quite different from, let's say, what the end scenario looks like currently in AI. Why I say that is because there's actually very less policy discussion around how AI and ML is to be treated. It has been pretty much been treated at par with any other emerging technology, any other innovative technology. So because of that, so they have a Ministry of AI. They have the By Future Foundation, which essentially the role of the ministry and the foundation being that anything that cannot and does not fit into the existing regulatory landscape, existing regulations, can find itself a place being regulated in, let's say, it's not exactly a sandbox, but more of, let's say, a closed environment, such that the technology in itself can thrive and they can essentially offer solutions to UAE and the region. With that background, I think what we have seen, there are different sectors in which, within fintech itself, within fintech and AI itself, where we have seen immense surge in the use of AI-based products and algorithms backend. Majorly, we've seen, let's say, compliance is a sector where we've seen a lot of solutions come up. Fraud, anti-money laundering, again, forensics, that's financial forensics, that's a sector again which has been very been impacted by advent of AI. Loan lending, again, lending-based solutions is something we have seen a surge in, and majorly and significantly we've seen a surge in use of AI in investment advice, in robo advisory, those digital investment management, wealth management. I think those are the sectors which have been majorly impacted by this. Now, when it comes to the actual, let's say, problems or the approach in itself, the problems actually vary depending on which of the sectors does this fall under. Majorly, if you were to draw a broad distinction from a very transactional perspective and a very consumer protection perspective, what really changes the dynamics in terms of a conversation around regulations, or what should a regulator do, or how should one oversee such transactions. What is one, the level of reliance on an AI-based solution? What is the layer, or what is the level of interaction of a consumer with this AI solution is actually what has changed the dynamics completely when it comes to the fintech solutions. So for instance, when it comes to pure AI compliance solutions, it has been pretty straightforward and very basic. The only problem with those being that given the lack of policy conversation around it, it has limited itself to perhaps, let's say, ethics and perhaps code of conducts when it comes to AI, and more so drawing all the compliance-based answers from the existing regulations, which may or may not serve the purpose of technology. So that's a major problem that we have seen, especially in the compliance sector. When it comes to the AML and fraud sector, especially given the dynamics of the region, money laundering is a major concern, and money laundering is also heavily cracked upon by the regulators, especially after the FATF guidance in the last 2-3 years. Most regulators in the region have taken major cognizance of this, and they have they have been very positive in relying on such solutions, which can perhaps help in forensics when it comes to the financial technology solutions in itself. When it comes to loan and lending, the revision, or let's say the more change in thought process that we've seen is actually not in the sector of AI, but in the actual treatment of fintech solutions in itself. So we have a lot of clients who have come up with fintech solutions which are, let's say, a mix of they perhaps use algorithms, they use open APIs, they're using blockchain, they're using perhaps all myriad of emerging technologies which are there in that space. In that, what we have essentially seen in the region is that AI actually has taken a little backseat when it comes to the regulatory oversight, because the risk that regulators have seen is more with actually the outcome of such fintech solutions, which means that the interaction, like I said, the interaction of the consumer with that fintech solution in itself has been a major concern of the regulator. And hence, the area in which actually AI gets regulated the most, or the governance of AI comes the most, is what is the level or what is the ratio of reliance of this AI on this AI solution vis-a-vis the output and the outcome that you're giving to your client if you are a fintech solution. So that has been the major, let's say, area of conversation when it comes to especially regulators in this region. Like I mentioned earlier, we also do a bit of policy work, and we are the ambassadors for Arab Monetary Fund in the region. So within our conversation with various central banks and monetary authorities here, what we have kind of realized is that regulators, at least especially in the Middle East, have actually not basketed technologies so much so as much as they have really basketed the outputs of those technologies. So what essentially is going to be the outcome of that technology, whether it's an open banking solution, whether it's a micropayment solution, whether it's an open robo advisory and investment advisory kind of solution. They've tried to basket it that, and then they've weaved it in a reverse fashion. They're weaving regulations in a very reverse fashion. I do understand from my whatever limited understanding I have of other jurisdictions that this is exactly not an approach that has been taken by other regulators in the world. But what I can tell you from a very Middle East and UAE experience is that we've seen a major surge in use of emerging technologies like AI and blockchain, and their regulators are more than happy to let them go hand in hand. The only and that's why I keep it at the last. One of the only major concerns that we have seen, especially in the sector of AI, is in the case of robo advisory. Fundamentally, because what we have noticed is that it is absolutely at loggerheads with the concept of investment advice. And the reason I use the word loggerheads is because most fintech solutions that we have seen have used AI and ML solutions backend. What has also happened is that they have been sitting on massive, insane amounts of data sets, which they have kind of relied on to come out with something which is perhaps as good as a recommendation, but which is, which could have the power to sort of influence what a consumer does in terms of decision making. Now, investment advice, robo advisory, is extremely regulated in this part of the world, and so it is in different other parts of the world. So that blend between the technology and your conventional practices of investments is something that is now seeing a major shift, at least in this part of the world, especially because there are major concerns, and that's where actually AI governance plays the most important role. There are major concerns to analyze and assess what is it that the consumer is really relying on. Especially given the times that we are living in, everyone is really going after the retail clients. We're actually seeing a reduction in products and services and financial products that are getting offered to accredited investors. Mostly everything is for retail investors. And in that situation, what is getting very difficult is for a regulator to sort of rest liability on perhaps the AI commissioner or the corporates which are using it, or perhaps the data processor. So that dynamics is actually now slightly getting difficult by the day, because what's really the answer to this, right? Even if you're trying to rest liability on the person who's commissioning the AI, on the legal person who's commissioning that such an AI solution, you can't always assure reparation and damages to the person who's the aggrieved party or who's the victim, right? So especially when it comes to the trading aspect, or especially when it comes to, again, reliance on AI based solutions, that's something that I think has seen a major shift in the last let's say few quarters or a year even. So I think that should do it. Sorry, happy to take any questions.
Right, can you hear me now, please?
Yes.
Right, sorry for that, but I know the issue with the microphone. Right, thank you very much, Akasha, for answering the question. We will probably take a question from, we will need to stop your presentation at the moment, and we'll move to Dr. Rodriguez in this respect, because he needs to be leaving us in a couple of minutes. So, Dr. Rodriguez, we've got 2 questions for you, and I'll be very thankful if you can keep them relatively short since we're running out of time. So, Dr. Rodriguez, the first question for you is, what are some of the revolutionary trends in the education sector and how artificial intelligence is helping?
Well, certainly, yeah, to keep it short and brief, ultimately everything that is important in life is sort of brief. So let me just give it to you very quickly from what we are doing, especially in my university, what is happening in Europe as well. The AI machine learning beyond the classroom setting has gone into aspects such as taking attendance. For example, we have AI-enabled cameras that process the facial recognition of the students, as well as the positioning, whether they are paying attention in base of certain non-verbal cues. Obviously, there is certain regulations in this regard. When it comes to Europe, we cannot do this for certain constraints, especially GDPR. In India, the bandwidth is a bit freer, so we can do that. And of course, we ask the students to sign an NDA as well, and everything has been regulated in that regard. On the other hand, AI has taken care of designing the curriculum even for new programs. It has taken trends from other universities or other institutions, linked down what is important, what is critical, as well as doing a cloud network to see what is in demand from the industry. And obviously, running down the curriculum in that regard. And as we come down, you'll be surprised to know that even AI can monitor unfair practices during examinations, not just in terms of whether people are cheating or not, but also whether the answers are being copied from some other person in based on how much of the text is similar. This is, of course, called similarity index. So considering this, AI can really revolutionize the higher education industry as well as the school sector, but it will depend upon the country that implements it. In our university, we have developed chatbot. So this chatbot, what it does, I tell you, I take particularly neural networks as a subject. So what has happened is there used to be n number of questions coming from the students on regular basis every semester. New students, old students, both simultaneously. It used to accumulate 2,000 questions even every week. So to save time on this, I, along with teaching assistants, develop a chatbot, and this chatbot has been loaded with all the questions and answer keys for the same. So what has happened? The chatbot has developed certain abilities like Google Home or Amazon Echo, and it's almost not so simple to differentiate from a human interface. So all the questions are being answered by the chatbot. There's quite a stringent interface on this regard. We have made sure that they don't make the difference, and it's a 24/7 available system. So whenever the student has a doubt, doesn't have to wait for the professors to come in the picture and answer it by email. So this is quite an improvement. And again, coming back to the square one of the regulatory body part, in India it's fine, in Singapore it's fine. If you try to apply this in Europe, nearly impossible. So we need to consider these aspects country-wise. Of course, there are ways where you can do it, ways where you cannot do it. And before we move to the next question, I just have actually 2 questions to pose to the audience, which it might answer me today or maybe offline as well, which is something I've been trying to figure out myself as well during research, which is we all talk about machine learning algorithms, or more commonly known as AI, but what happens if machine learning goes wrong? And what happens is if it reaches that stage of singularity, where the cognitive ability of AI is beyond the human spectrum. What do we do then? How do we regulate it? Because there is no regulatory body for AI. Even if we try to make it, it will be extremely complicated to regulate it. There is software, there is data, there is human involvement, there are various aspects to be considered. And as of yet, no country even those which have Ministry of Artificial Intelligence can really assure the regulation is up to the mark. That is one thing. And second thing, we also have a big concern in AI called bias, which I'm sure you heard about. Now, bias. Bias is a very funny term when it comes to machine learning, because we all speak about it like we can really get rid of it, but think about one simple thing. The original code was programmed by somebody. That somebody, that bias of that person is still ingrained in the code. How are you going to get rid of that? That is my question for the audience on this regard. So now we can proceed with the next question.
Thank you very much. And the next question for you is, could you apprise us of developments in augmented reality and virtual reality sectors? What is the predictability of the same?
When it comes to VR and AR, I'm sure you have seen that it's very useful when it comes to autonomous vehicles, shopping, tourism, even for certain aspects of entertainment as well. That is nothing that you are not aware about. So I'm not going to go into the area. I will go more into three key areas which are pretty intriguing to me. One is the psychological aspect. So there are treatments such as phobias which can be solved using. So if you have a phobia against spiders in general terms, you can represent that in the augmented reality hemisphere. Make sure that the psychological treatment is effective with the patients without actually forcing them to go in the real scenario where it can be traumatic as well. So this is one aspect, dealing with the combination of augmented reality and psychological treatments when it comes to therapy. On the other hand, we talk about avatars. Now, since everything is online for the last 6 months on average, and it looks like it's going to continue like this for some time, even though we have the hope, falsely backed hope that everything will go back to normal. We will continue somehow in a blended learning or blending scenario where online will be present. We have the sense of avatars, online avatars, representations of ourselves in the digital world. I don't know how many of you have wondered about this, but there is a huge privacy as well as data concern on this regard, because your face, your overall physical structure, as well as your psychological well-being is going to be exposed in that augmented reality space, and is freely to be hijacked, hacked, and misused by anybody. So it's a big legal concern, which I'm not seeing any regulation so far. So it's something to be looking after in this regard. And the last aspect I would like to highlight is the 5G. I'm sure you all have heard about the revolution. When it comes to mobile phones, we went from 4G now to 5G. Now just think of the combination of 5G with augmented reality and machine learning all together. Of course, all this being cloud-based. It can be a tremendous, as I feel one of the speakers, Ratul, mentioned earlier, can be a tremendous honeypot for cyber hacks. Similarly here, it can be an invitation to just please come, steal my data, misuse it. There is no problem. That is what is going to happen unless we really regulate it in a stringent way when it comes to the legal aspects.
Great, thank you very much for answering our questions. If there will be any questions for you at the end and you won't be with us, we will try to get the questions somehow to you so you can answer them to our participants. So Akasha, I'm moving to you again. I'm absolutely sorry that I needed to interrupt your presentation, and we've got a following question for you, which is, what is the role of algorithmic trading in open banking and finance?
Right. Sure. So I'd like to believe in that there are two ways to look about it. One, use of AI in open banking and open finance solution, or use of AI after, or let's say parallel to an open banking or open finance solutions changes a lot of conversation. Why I say that is because the essential aim of open banking and open finance is to bring control back in the hands of the consumers in themselves. That's why when it comes to AI, again, the question then remains, are you using AI to support an account initiation service or a payment initiation service to the extent that a person or a consumer is relying on your AI-based outcomes, information, data, suggestions, advice, anything that has got to do with that? That's one. Secondly, then, or are you then using the information that has then been collected by one of these AISPs or PISPs to further to further analyze the data, to further understand what the trading patterns are, to further understand what the financial, investment patterns are, and then going on and selling it out in the market. So that changes the dynamics completely. Similarly, when it comes even within the AISP and PISP solution, if you are using AI just for account information services, perhaps you're doing a good job, because then AI can really reduce the time which is consumed in perhaps gathering the information or analyzing what information might be necessary for what kind of financial products. So as far as account information services in open banking and open finance are concerned, AI might still be doing a more of let's say a support function there. However, when it comes to payment initiation services, that could be a regulatory nightmare simply for two reasons. One, already a payment in case of a payment initiation service, you're giving the charge in the hand of a fintech solution, which is perhaps going to gather information and consent and the first layer of authentication from the customer and certain other commercial banks or let's say financial institutions which are making those financial products available. Already the lines are blurred for you to ensure that the consumer and the customer has given a free consent to, one, the data being shared or being used the way it is being used in your fintech solution, and two, the fact that a certain financial product should be bought, traded, or invested in. Again, that is being undertaken at the layer of fintech, which is a private player in case of an open finance or an open banking solution. Now, if you add another layer of AI to that, which is brilliant, which might reduce a lot of time, but then what you're really doing then is you're significantly reducing a consumer's interaction with, one, a human being, and two, with a regulator. So you're giving that layer of, let's say, you might, from a regulatory perspective, it might be very difficult for you to cushion the problems that come out of it. And that's just my humble opinion that we are still testing how open banking and open finance is going to play out in different parts of the world. It has done a good job in UK and some parts of Europe. Middle East is still testing open banking, open finance, open APIs. AI and open banking we are a few years away from this becoming a very fruitful and a good solution. Right now, it could be a regulatory nightmare. When it comes to payment initiation services, as far as account information services are concerned, I think there's not much to it that really changes. It just supports that whole process.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. And now we're moving to Porja. Porja, we've got two questions for you. So the first question is, how much has the startup ecosystem adopted different algorithmic tools, and what governance issue do they face from relevant technology regulation? And I'll be very thankful if you can keep your presentation relatively short, since we're running out of time. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thank you very much.
Great. So I'm just going to break these questions into two essential parts. The first one is, how much has the startup ecosystem adopted to different algorithmic tools? Now, for this, we have to understand how do we define startups in India. Now, if we compare startups to the larger companies, then that's going to be slightly difficult. So when you're talking about startups, we have to understand that the only thing that concerns them is a very, very small budget allocation to something like this. From my experience, like I mentioned, that I've worked with over 500 startups, and less than 5% of them are working in hardcore AI and the ML space. So that's, and I'm going to take that ratio forward, assuming that that is the number of startups, core AI or ML startups that we have in India. Now, basically, to have a hardcore AI startup, one needs to have a very deep understanding of this technology. Now, for basically to AI to show results, a very strong side or understanding of deep learning and things tech related to that is essential. What I have seen and what has been my experience in this ecosystem, specifically while working with startups, not even the SMEs, the not even the medium enterprises. I'm talking only about startups. There has been a clear lack of knowledge. The founders here, or even the team that is supporting the founders, they do not understand. There's a lack of research when it comes to implementing AI in the startups. Now, the resources that you need to have, specifically the human capital, there's a clear lack of understanding of the complex problems. Now, whenever you have a startup which is working purely in AI, you need to have a human resources which understands physics, robotics, computer science with a focus on ML, and this kind of right talent is certainly missing. There are a lot of startups using the ready-made AI tools, which sufficient. But even to use those tools, you need sufficiently skilled resource to interpret the result correctly. Now, while you're doing all of this, there is a severe budget constraint that I mentioned. The second problem with startups and AI in India is it takes a considerable amount of time for a relatively new technology or a relatively new tech like AI to show results. Now, this gap between theory and real implementation is really huge. It requires extensive interaction with potential customers to understand their problems and accordingly train models, which is again time and capital intensive. So getting the right data and using the right using the right kind of resources for that is another challenge. You also require heavy pieces of machinery and computers and things like that whenever a startup is wanting to get into AI, specifically working at hypersonic speeds. You need advanced processors. Now, again, there's a budget constraint. So if you look at all of this, however passionate a founder is about AI, it ultimately boils down to funding and the budget constraints that they have. They need. There are short-term solutions available. There's cloud computing. There are other parallel processing systems. But when data grows and eventually they need to apply next generation computing infrastructure, example, quantum computing or something like that, they do not have the necessary resources. There's no research, there's no R&D department. So lack of scalable product plus lack of human resources ultimately leads to shutting shops for the startup. So this has been one of the experiences that I've had working with AI-based startups. Now, also to have AI based strategy, companies require a robust IT infrastructure. Now, bigger companies like Amazon, Google, although they're categorized as startups, but they have specific budget allocations. So, I think despite opportunities, we are slow to adopt AI specifically in India. We see more development of ready to use technology. We use speech recognition, we use face recognition, but still I don't think these products are also trained for the Indian data. And with respect specifically in reference with India and AI, I think India cannot miss the AI revolution if it wishes to be in the part, in the race of this global development. But at the same time, the diversity and the complexity present in India, I think that also gives, even AI needs India equally, because I think India gives a very rich challenge set of problems, for AI to develop. So this is the first part of the question. Now, coming back to the second part of the question, which says what are the governance challenges? I think Ratul has covered it well. Even Ms. Namzoshi has covered it well, saying the different challenges that we have in India. Now, although the current government has tried, and even the government that we had in the past, they did try to have funds allocated, little movement for acceptance of artificial information, but because our laws are slightly conventional, I think there are a lot of definitions which we need to change. Now, AI relies entirely on data. There is absence of direct application of human mind. Now, the problem here is who's to be held liable. Something that which Ms. Namzoshi also highlighted. There is researchers have even legislators in India have anticipated threats of complete automation. Now, there's always a problem, in completely automizing or completely using AI as to who's to be held liable. What if the data is compromised? What if there is biased data? So, suggestions. I think the government is working at all levels towards creating an AI-friendly tech, but there are some massive legal issues which need to be addressed. There are issues when it comes to AI and copyright. There are issues when it comes to AI and ownership. There are issues when it comes to AI employment laws, IPR. So I think we need to amend our current laws if we have to accommodate AI in its entirety. Otherwise at the end of the day, even instead of, even if we have a robust independent system in place, at the end of the day we are going to still hold the human force behind it liable, and I don't think that solves the purpose of AI. So I think, yes. So also, who's going to be punished, what is the nature of liability, is very difficult to determine all of this in India. So with these two problems existing, lack of infrastructure and lack of legal acceptance in entirety, I think startups are finding it really very difficult to accept AI in its complete form. I think that's what has been my experience working with startups here in India, and India specifically, and startups who go from India to Singapore. That's been my experience here.
Great, thank you very much for the answer. And now, following to your next question is, what regulatory issues in India are facing now in the area of cryptocurrency and blockchains? How has the startup ecosystem fared in such regulatory space?
Okay, so I think when it comes to blockchain and cryptocurrencies, regulatory uncertainty is not exclusive in India. We have it pretty much in the US. We have it in the UK. There were oppositions to the US laws on blockchain and cryptocurrency. The EU also, I mean, that pushed a lot of EU cryptocurrency companies out of EU. I think India is no exception to this. All of us know that since 2017, 2016, there has been a constant tussle between RBI and the cryptocurrency companies. RBI is clearly not willing to give go ahead to the Indian banks. And there was a Supreme Court case, and the Supreme Court lifted the de facto ban up. And now we again have news that we could very soon have a law which will ban the entire ban cryptocurrency trading entirely. Although we do not have access to the draft bill, but from the reports that are out, the government might encourage cryptocurrencies and use of blockchain technology, because there is no way we can ignore the importance that blockchain technology is going to get to India, the jobs that it's going to increase. We can't ignore that fact, but at the same time, we are still very conservative when it comes to cryptocurrency trading. So I think that is going to be one hassle. So I think before we look at blockchain and laws around it, we need to understand if India is ready for crypto. And I think during this pandemic, during COVID times, we're advising a few crypto and blockchain based startups. And I think this 5-6 months have witnessed peak trading volumes for the exchanges that we are working with. People are definitely looking for an alternative to USD and INR now. And I personally believe that crypto industry is going through a revival process in India. And even though crypto uncertainty is rampant, there is a crypto community which is eager to adopt the digital currencies. Some banks have also now started to work with crypto firms. Multiple exchanges in India are accepting deposits and withdrawals, and they are working through the banks. So I think after COVID and the economic depression that we are going through, and all of us know that there's no end, we cannot fathom when this will end. And naturally, the economic recovery is going to take way more longer than it did in the earlier recessions. So I think we are hoping a lot from the GST committee in India, because GST on cryptocurrency trading could give a very good boost to the Indian economy. Now it's for us to see if the Indian regulators will provide a clear set of rules for healthy business environment. A lot of founders working in the cryptocurrency space feel that specifically in the post-pandemic area, there will be a massive acceptance to crypto-related payments. Now, basically, it's time where our Reserve Banks sheds this inhibitions and we adopt a progressive outlook for cryptocurrencies. And also, while drafting the bills, which talks about absolutely banning crypto as Mr. Subramaniam Swamy mentioned after the Supreme Court lifted up the ban on the RBI regulation, that we cannot ignore something that is inevitable. So I think crypto and blockchain is something that is inevitable, and what we need to do basically is to have more friendly laws and more friendly regulations around it. And I feel that while drafting this law as an exception, the government should consider involving the stakeholders of this ecosystem rather than just going by the books. I think that might that might help us having better laws. With I think, but with cryptocurrencies and with with specifically with cryptocurrencies on the legal aspects, there's a lot of there's lack of clarity when it comes to how do you identify these cryptocurrencies, considering it's very difficult to identify the source. So the chances of fraud is high. It's not completely fraud proof yet. So I think even the stakeholders, the founders and of ICOs and of exchanges, I think all of us need to work together as a team and try to make the system more fraud proof so that we can expect a more progressive acceptance from the government as well. So yeah, so that's it. I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you very much. So we've got that tool claiming for the audience that, just to add to your point, Punja, governments are pro-chain but anti-crypto. So, and Tamil Nadu just released a policy document on blockchains recently. So now is the time for the audience to ask any questions they might have for our speakers. So there's a question for Punjab. Punjab, what is your take on the issues related to liability of errors caused by the artificial intelligence in healthcare sector, and what can be a solution in asserting liability in the cases of medical negligence where artificial intelligence use is increasing day by day?
Absolutely. So I think one of the biggest hindrance with AI and these technologies is assessing liability. I mean, I do not really want to restrict it to healthcare sector, but any sector for that matter. How are we going to assess who's exactly liable? And that is the entire point of debate. That is where acceptance about AI. That is where the entire debate about AI, I think, starts in India. When it comes to healthcare sector, I think apart from what government is trying to do, I think there are a lot of startups and companies, smaller companies that I'm working with, who are trying to really, really change or bring a change into the healthcare sector. People want to save data, healthcare data, sensitive information. They have want to save it in the clouds and things like that. But again, the point is how are we going to protect it? Now, for this, there are two aspects to this. One is working on the Consumer Protection Act also. So even for a traditional, typical, conventional medical negligence case, to prove that there was a medical negligence, the consumer has to go through a lot of turmoil. I mean, even the Consumer Protection Act, although we have an amended act now, but still to establish, because evidences, a layman is not aware about the terms that happens, the terms, the medical terms and things like that. So even with the traditional medical negligence, there are so many issues. Now, when it comes to AI, it's going to be an absolutely different ball game, because we need to train. For the first step is going to be to train everybody who's involved in this justice, the judicial system, right from the lawyers to the judges to everybody, because until they understand how this operates, assessing liability is going to be impossible. So I think the only way to do this is constant training and amendment in our education systems, and with with something that the new policy, education policy that we've got, where students and youngsters will be trained more with such emerging technologies. I think we can expect a change, but we have a long way to go. It can't just happen suddenly. We can't just have AI in our laws, and we can't expect that from the next moment our judges will be comfortable ruling on something which is so technical. So I think the only way is education. There's no other way.
Great, thank you very much for answering the question. Now we've got question 2, Akshata. So how is the Middle East using some technologies like robo advisory in the BFSI market?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part. How is Middle East using technologies like robo and then?
A robo advisory in the BFSI market.
Right. So it's actually interesting. So now this was not something that we were honestly expecting would come out so soon. But what did, especially when you look at the region, what you need to remember is that the regional dynamics is such that there is a massive population of HNIs, high net worth individuals, and SMEs, and which means that there is a huge potential for um, for let's say a very mid-level financial trading to happen, which perhaps might not be the case if you go more towards perhaps US or even in India, and there's a huge market. So there's a significant amount of wealth management and investment management activities which go on in this region. And to tap into that, robo advisory was something, as I said, that's not something that we were expecting, but which really came out. Now, in the fashion that it has come out is that they've really tapped into how the API and the technological governance angle of it is something that can be, looked into. So, as far as the regulators are concerned, what they've said is that we will treat you like you are any other fintech solution, which means that you will comply with any specific financial regulations which are in existence. But as far as the technology is concerned, it is actually very impressive that most of the free zones here have decided to kind of go into the utmost details of how the technology is going to operate. So when it comes to risk assessment, when it comes to threat intelligence, which is related to the technology, that's something that they have gone much deeper into. And that's exactly why when it comes to actually robo advisory, it has picked up in this region much faster than perhaps, we don't have too many examples in other parts of the world, barring US. Wealthfront has definitely done really well. But yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, they have looked at more as to the output that goes on to a consumer than the technologies that have gone behind these. That's why even blockchain is something that could at least seep into the markets. I mean, that's the good, let's say, lesson that one can learn from Middle East, that they let the technologies seep into the markets without first restricting the entry in itself. Once they start entering the markets, they kind of dealt and tried to fix their licensing systems. They tried to fix their activity systems, activity-based licensing systems, and the technology governance. That's something that regulators took that charge upon themselves, that as a regulator, we will have a technical team which will sit there and question you. Their only job is to every 7 days, every 1 month, ask you to report, ask you to, question you for the technology that you're using. So yeah, that's that.
Great, thank you very much for answering the question. So Rathel put a wee note on our chat box, and I'll read that out for you. So this part of a quintessential FETML debate. At the note, accountability would try to determine how to solve this problem. Solutions range from treating artificial intelligence as a separate person and buying it, insurance from which to paying fines, etc., or splitting liability between developers and deployers. But we really don't have one answer. So this was actually to the question question that was already asked to Ratul. So I'm just reading that out for the person. But we don't really have one answer right now. The NITI Agile document on the responsibility of artificial intelligence lists all the solution for accountability. And lastly, we've got a question for Ratul again. So how will the new data protection law affect the emerging tech companies, affecting especially fintech companies?
Right, right. That's a great question actually, because there's just a lot going on when it comes to fintech, right? Just because of the nature of data that is at play. So if you look at the RBI came out with a regulation back in 2018, which said which determined how you can store financial data in India and outside of India, right? So initially, the notification said that you cannot send out financial data outside of India except for 24 hours in certain circumstances, and then you need to bring it back, so on and so forth. Now, the clash happens with the proposed PDP is that. Under the PDP, it becomes SPD. Financial data is categorized as SPD, which is sensitive personal data. Now, a totally different set of recommendations and stipulations apply to sensitive personal data, which are at loggerheads only in terms of cross-border transfer of data. That's the limited point that I'm addressing right now. In terms of how sensitive personal data can be transferred to other countries and in which circumstances, right? So you have your regular adequacy requirements. You have common clauses, so on and so forth. So there's just a lot of conversation around the conflict that goes on between sector-specific regulations and the PDP, both of which try to regulate fintech in some degree or shape or the other. And financial data is right at the center of all of this, which currently just asks the question, which particular instrument regulates me, right? What am I supposed to go to? So I'm not even getting into the debate of the non-personal data framework right now, because that is pretty much so much in the air that I'm starting a conversation on that right now will probably not end anytime soon. So to answer your question very shortly, the effect is just more confusion, and there is requirement for some alignment when it comes to sector-specific regulations and overarching regulations such as the proposed PDP. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you very much. And the same question is the same question to Ponja. Ponja, what do you think? How will the new data protection law affect the emerging tech companies, especially in the fintech companies? And I think we've got quite some issues with connection because Ponja just left the conference. Right, so since we can't get Ponja back to our conversation, if there are any further questions to our panelists, feel free to put them in the chat box. That's the final call. Since there seems to be no further question for our panelists, I will thank you very much for joining us today to discuss about algorithmics and all the problems that algorithms might have on law and policy. I would now kindly invite everyone to leave the conference except of the panelists. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very lovely afternoon.